Good morning. I'd first like to say how happy I am to be here and to be opening this day. It's really good to see so many knowledgeable, diverse, experienced and dedicated people working in collaboration to try and drive tangible progress to achieving the very ambitious 8th Sustainable Development Goal, which, just to remind you all, is to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labour. At the moment, the world can feel like a pretty bleak and scary place. And to be in a room where there is that collective will to do something positive, to help find creative, practical and measurable ways to tackle and work towards ending what is one of the most egregious of all human rights abuses, is a really heartening experience, and we must hold on to that. Firstly, just for a brief introduction, my name's Annie Kelly, and I'm a human rights editor and journalist at The Guardian and Observer newspapers. And I've been reporting on modern slavery and human trafficking across the world since 2011, when I took on the role as editor of The Guardian's newly launched and very snappily titled Modern Day Slavery in Focus series, which was the first ever dedicated journalism series on this issue of its kind, launched by a national newspaper. And at the time, back in 2011, no one was really reporting on modern slavery. And while my background as a foreign correspondent somewhat prepared me for the traumatic stories I would soon be dealing with, at the time I had no concept of the complex, challenging and grimly enlightening work ahead of me. And it's no exaggeration to say in those first years, it was a proper baptism of fire. And over the next 13 years, either through my own reporting or through stories and investigations I commissioned other journalists to do, the work took me from electronics factories in Malaysia to cobalt mines in the DRC, from cannabis farms in Derbyshire to strawberry fields in Spain, and entered some of the darkest corners of the human experience. Yet along the way, I've also met the most astonishing people, beacons of pure light amid this darkness, who've taught me about the beauty of the human soul and the astonishing capacity for survival and recovery despite almost unimaginable suffering. I've also met many other incredible people who have and still are dedicating their lives to fighting this terrible crime and are using all their skills and talents to try to force governments, corporations, individuals and societies as a whole to be held responsible for their part in the continuing abuse and exploitation of people for profit. And I'm sure that most of you in the room know this, but just as a reminder, under UK law, modern slavery is defined as the recruitment, movement, harbouring or receiving of children, women or men through the use of forcing, coercion, abuse of vulnerability, deception or other means for the purpose of exploitation. And when we think about slavery, I think many people still think about the transatlantic slave trade. Yet the crime of modern slavery and human trafficking today can be one where the physical shackles of the past have been replaced by psychological forms of coercion and control. Fear, violence, or the threat of violence, isolation, intimidation of family back home, insecure immigration status, the need to provide for children, and almost always debt are all effective methods of exploitation for traffickers. Another thing I learnt about modern slavery in all of its nefarious forms, forced labour, debt bondage, trafficking for sexual exploitation, is that it's everywhere, all around us. It's sewn into the clothes that we wear, it percolates through the coffee we drink, it's in our phones, in our cars, and in the food that we eat. Now, when I think about modern slavery here in the UK, and when I walk around the streets of my own city, it's as if there's this invisible parallel world that is operating all around us, a world that's both hidden and in plain sight. It could be the man washing up in the restaurant where you're eating, the people cleaning your car, the young woman giving you a £10 pedicure, a carer in your relative's nursing home, or the hands that pick the fruit that you feed your children after school. It's almost impossible to know just how many people are trapped in modern slavery around the world. The most commonly used estimate is the Global Slavery Index of 50 million, which includes all forms of slavery. The index says of these, 1 in 4 of those in modern slavery are children. There are a staggering 22 million women and girls trapped in forced marriage. Other statistics say that there are around 1.4 domestic workers, mainly women, trapped in exploitation and domestic servitude. Here in the UK, the government estimates that around 100,000 people are in some form of modern slavery, although the number could easily be higher. The International Labour Organization, known as the ILO, has calculated that around the globe, 27 million people are trapped in forced labour, a form of modern slavery which relates to someone profiting from another person's work. And today I know we're all going to be doing some really important work discussing and debating new and collaborative ways to try and tackle this crime. But what I wanted to do before you begin was tell you about some of the people that I've met over the past 13 years who have lived through the reality of modern slavery here in the UK and around the world. Now, these stories are really hard to listen to, but they are why we're all here today. And it's really the only way that we can understand the true face of this terrible crime and the legacy it leaves on people's lives. I think it's really important that their voices are heard before we start the hard work ahead of us. Firstly, I wanted to tell you about a woman from Ukraine called Julia that I spent a lot of time with last year as part of a podcast series we did for The Guardian, telling the story of how she was trafficked from Ukraine into forced labour and sexual exploitation here in the UK. By the time the police smashed down the door of an apartment in a smart block in Sunbury-on-Thames in September 2019, Julia had spent more than 5 years under the control of criminal gangs, making huge amounts of money from women's prostitution across the UK. The gang who were currently in control of Julia were making about £500 a day from the sale of her body. They were the third gang to exploit her since she'd been trafficked from her village in Ukraine to the UK in the back of a lorry in 2014. Julia's story, like many of the survivors that I've met, is complicated. Born into poverty and isolation in a rural village in Ukraine, her options as a young woman were stifled by a lack of education and employment. When she had a baby and she was abandoned by her husband, she tried to make ends meet, working as a seasonal worker in farms over the border in Poland, but she could never make enough money. She was always having to take loans out to see her through. Her baby got sick, her elderly mother needed medicine, and when a woman in her village offered her work abroad while she was waiting for her next job, she took it. That decision, born out of desperation and a lack of any other real choices, put her on the path into the darkness of sex trafficking and exploitation, thousands of miles away from her baby girl. Taken across the channel in the back of a lorry, Julia was told when she arrived that she had to pay £150 a week to sleep on the floor of a house she hadn't picked, packed full of other Ukrainians. She spoke no English, knew nobody, and they'd taken her passport. She was also told she owed thousands of pounds to the gang who brought her here. She was given a job cleaning hotel rooms in London, working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, but after 2 weeks of work, she was given £90 in wages. Fast forward 8 months, Julia is in a desperate situation. All of the money she was making was going on trying to pay off her debts and her rent. She was sick from the stress. She couldn't afford to buy food for herself, let alone to send money home for her baby. The people she owed money started threatening her daughter. She was about to become homeless and had nowhere else to go, so she finally answered an ad for an escort agency. And within 24 hours, she was under the control of an organised crime gang. Julia says that for years she was shuttled from brothel to brothel. She had no control how many customers she was seeing or what she was expected to do. By the time the police found her, her bosses were taking so much of her money that she was only managing to send a few £100 home to her family every 3 or 4 months. She told me, at the time the police came, I was so tired, mentally, physically. I was being forced to work from morning to night. I didn't care anymore what happened. I just wanted it to be finished, to be over. I couldn't go on like that anymore. And the desperation to be able to provide for her children also pushed another woman, Samira, into the arms of exploiters. In April 2018, She kissed her baby goodbye and boarded a bus from her village in Morocco, bound for the strawberry fields of southern Spain. In her bag was a Spanish visa and a contract that promised her €40 a day plus food and accommodation, a fortune compared to what she'd be able to earn at home. When I met her a year later, her life was in ruins. Destitute, divorced by her husband and homeless, she said that she and the Moroccan women she'd worked alongside on a Spanish strawberry farm had been subjected to human trafficking, sexual assault and exploitation, and that her biggest mistake, other than coming to Spain, had been going to the police. She was one of around 20,000 Moroccan women that travel every year to Spain to pick strawberries in Andalusia under a seasonal worker visa scheme that's been operated between the Spanish and Moroccan governments since 2001. Strawberries from those fields end up in supermarkets in the UK and across Europe. Human rights groups told me that labour agents in Morocco recruiting for the farms deliberately looked for young women from rural villages with young children to feed who only understood Arabic, couldn't understand their contracts in Spain or claim their rights. It is, one said, a rigged system. Add cruelty, misogyny and sexism into this mix, and the route into modern slavery for these women is an easy one. Samira said that the treatment that she and the women on the farm where she ended up was horrendous. They worked in permanently crouching positions with a single break of 30 minutes a day with no toilet breaks. There was no access to drinking water. Their accommodation was filthy, crowded and unsanitary. She said that they were not paid their wages or given money for food. They were also, she claims, subjected to serious sexual violence, and some of them were forced into prostitution. The farm was very far away from the nearest town. We were totally isolated, she told me. We didn't speak Spanish. We were desperate to send money home to our children. We had no power at all. When they tried to complain to the police, she says that the women were rounded up and many of them were forced back onto buses and sent back to Morocco without their wages. She and 8 other women escaped and sought help from a local lawyer. When we met them, they were all sleeping on the floor of the lawyer's apartment, waiting for their case to be heard in the Spanish courts. This never happened. The police never interviewed them as potential victims of trafficking. Their allegations were eventually discounted by the courts on a lack of evidence, and although the Spanish government finally granted them a humanitarian visa, many said they could never go home because of the shame that their abuse had brought on their families. Human rights groups have told me since that the situation has only got worse for Moroccan women and that abuse is still endemic in this industry. I'd like to tell you now that Julia and Samira are doing really well. Julia's been reunited with her daughter and is building a life for herself in the UK. Samira is now back in Morocco, reunited with her children, although not her husband, and working on anti-trafficking initiatives to try and stop what happened to her happening to others. I could keep going on with these stories because I've come across so many. There's Marilyn, a mother of 4 children who travelled to Saudi Arabia for a job as a domestic worker and who never came home after suffering years of abuse at the hands of her employer. There's Addy, another little boy, this time from the DRC, who lost his legs when the tunnel in the cobalt mine that supplies some of our biggest tech companies collapsed on top of him. There's Min, a young boy from Vietnam, who was trafficked into cannabis cultivation here in the UK, then prosecuted by the police and sent to immigration detention. And there is Amira, a 13-year-old girl forced into child marriage in Afghanistan, whose parents insisted she get married after the Taliban prevented girls from going to secondary school. As I said, none of these stories are easy to listen to, but they are vital in understanding what we're up against, what we're all facing, and what is really at stake. Back in 2011, when I started this work, very little was ever published in the media about slavery and human trafficking. It felt to me then like very few people outside the NGO, legal and human rights worlds even knew it existed. Fast forward 13 years, and this is thankfully different. I've seen a huge sea change in media interest, public understanding, and government engagement on modern slavery, both around the world and here in the UK. But part of the reason that I'm so happy to be here talking to you about this today is that in recent years, I've felt another sea change when it comes to this fight against modern slavery, both globally and here in the UK. and this time it's a very unwelcome one. The most recent data from the Global Slavery Index, which was released in 2021, showed a sharp rise in the number of people trapped in modern slavery around the world compared to its last dataset published in 2016. The index said that the worsening situation had occurred against a backdrop of increasing conflict, environmental degradation, over a decade of global democratic decline, a global rollback of women's rights, and the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and our response to it. This in turn has led to a disruption to employment and education for tens of millions of people, an increase in the number of people living in extreme poverty, and the ongoing global migration crisis, which has come together to create almost perfect conditions for modern slavery and exploitation to thrive. And there is always money to be made from people's desperation. This year, the ILO calculated the profits being made from forced labour had risen sharply to £185 billion, as record numbers of people were forced into the worst forms of labour exploitation. This is a 37% rise from their last set of figures released in 2014. It calculated that traffickers, criminals and unscrupulous employers were making an average of nearly $10,000 for every victim. I know today is a global conference, but I think it's worth looking at what's happening here in the UK to get a sense of how the climate is changing for victims of modern slavery around the world. Here in the UK last year, the number of potential victims of modern slavery identified by the government reached record levels, with referrals for both women and children hitting an all-time high. At the same time, new domestic legislation introduced through the Illegal Migration Act, passed in July 2023, and the Nationality and Borders Act, which came into effect in January 2023, means that it's now more difficult for people who are trapped in modern slavery to get help. Under UK law now, if they've entered the UK illegally, which many victims of modern slavery do, they are seen first as a criminal and secondly as a potential victim. At the same time, help and protection to victims of modern slavery has been slashed. Prosecutions under the Modern Slavery Act have remained low, and the bar for being recognised as a victim of modern slavery has been raised considerably. Above all of this, the increasingly dark cloud of hostility towards migration and foreign workers is swirling, a further disincentive for victims to come forward and ask for help. In all of the years of reporting that I've done on this issue, one of the most common threats that that survivors have quoted their traffickers using to keep them from trying to seek help is that if they go to the police, they will be arrested, imprisoned and deported, with their debts unpaid. Increasingly, here and around the world, the traffickers have a point. It's getting harder to see why people would want to disclose the abuse they're facing. Just for a minute, let's return to Julia's story. She was able to escape the brothel where she was being exploited because she was felt able to disclose her abuse to the police when they raided the property. She went on to help the police dismantle a significant trafficking gang who were linked to over 120 women and get one of the only prosecutions under the Modern Slavery Act last year. Because of her traffickers went to prison, even if it wasn't for very long. The policeman in charge of that operation said it couldn't have happened without her. Yet because she was trafficked to the UK in the back of a lorry from Ukraine and entered the country illegally, she could now be arrested instead of offered protection and could have faced detention and deportation back to Ukraine, where her traffickers were threatening her family and her young daughter. The police investigation is likely never to have happened. Her traffickers would still be out there right now exploiting women. Yet amid all of these problems, there are solutions. There are people like all of you in this room who care, who are committed to trying to do something to end this appalling crime. A world where modern slavery is thriving is not a world any of us want to accept. Collaboration is the only way that we have a chance of actually making tangible progress on changing the systems, attitudes, and, crucially, political will needed to hold perpetrators to account and demand justice for victims. We have a responsibility and a moral duty to keep fighting, and in fact to fight harder than ever before, to try and end the misery of modern slavery and human trafficking in every corner of the world. And even though it's sometimes hard, we must never stop believing that there is a future where this kind of misery and pain is consigned to the history books forever. Thank you.